right, let's now summarize a lot of the stuff we've learned up until now and add just a little bit more detail on some other do's and don'ts. First off, for all map features, we want to orient the type horizontally. I'll show you some examples of that. Further, the labels should be placed so that they can easily be associated with the feature. We don't want to have the name of something being outside of it without, maybe what might work, but like, for example, we don't want to have the name of Indiana outside of the state of Indiana. We want to also avoid what it's a term called overprinting or overlapping text on other text or map features. For example, if we have black font that goes over a black road, or let's say an interstate in which we have it shown in black, the black font is going to essentially overprint or overlap with the black line, and it's going to kind of create a situation where it's going to be hard to see. So we want to try to reduce that as much as possible. Reduce it to a minimum. So constantly kind of be moving our text, moving our labels around so that we don't have that situation. And there's some options we can do. If there's if we can't do anything about it, we can add a mask. A mask is essentially just like a shape that's right behind the text. It helps to distinguish the text from that black line. Or we can add a halo, which is essentially this goes and follows the font of the text. Or you can have what's called a callout, in which you have essentially a mask connected to a line that points to a particular feature. Here are different ways that we can show font, different kind of perspectives, orientations, and the green ones are essentially the go. The yellow are, well, okay, but use some caution. The red is no, 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 no. And so we would prefer what's in the white box. At all times, we would prefer the horizontal, perfectly straight angle. But then, we got these other two that are acceptable, but we have to kind of be mindful of what we're doing it. But we would prefer this. These, okay, it's okay if you have like a border, we could do that. If we have maybe a river that goes north to south or south to north, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. But we want to be, if we're doing Indianapolis as a point, we don't really want to do that. And of course, upside down, no go, avoid at all costs. So in ArcGIS, you've got different options here, and the best position overwhelmingly is up and to the right. So up and to the right is by far the best position. So there's different things you can do. And so within ArcGIS, you can move them around based on different criteria. Also, I see here that there's leaders that have been added. These are lines that kind of connect, kind of like a call out. So these lines here, this is actually improper. Some problems with this is, first off, this line needs to be closer to the name. Also, we don't have, see if you can see very closely that the line actually goes inside of the place mark, inside the point. Typically, we don't do that. We want it to actually be separated. Here's using a halo. And so here we use a halo. I would never want to use yellow. I'm just using this for emphasis. And so the halo then helps it get it to stand out from those features behind it, from those streets and highways and byways that are behind our labels, behind our text. This would be masking, a very bad example of masking. You'd want much more subtle masks than this, ones in which it doesn't really have this much extra room. We don't want all that extra yellow. So this is an example of a mask, and once again, I'm using bad color choices. You would never want to choose these. I'm just using them just so they stand out. Here I'm playing around with the call out. So the call out, actually you can see how you have a line connected to a mask. And all this is stuff that can be done and worked with there in ArcGIS, which you can change the settings. And so I took the previous one and I just changed it. I had a more subtle mask and halo, so it doesn't really overpower, but definitely those names, those labels really stand out more than they did when we started. Further, there's a overprint button and output. I've never really used it before, so I don't know what it does. I don't know if it's effective, but my guess is it helps to avoid the overprint situation. Now let's talk about some guidelines for point features. First off, once again, we want to avoid overprinting. We want to avoid having those points on top of other points, but we really want to make sure that our text and our points, they don't overlap on top of each other. We also want to avoid placing the label directly to the right or left of the points. Kind of unwritten rule, we don't do that. The best, the most preferred, like I mentioned beforehand, is up and to the right. That's the best, most preferred. Others say down and to the right. It's not bad either, Some would say left, up and to the left is also okay, but by far the best is up and to the right is where we want to have our a particular label for a point feature. But it constantly causes you to revise, tinker, change things, move things around. I think this looks better here, actually. Maybe for one particular case, top and to the up and to the left is better. But no matter what you want to do is make sure that things are separated so logically you know that a particular label and text is associated with a particular map feature, with a particular point on the map. Similarly, we want to make sure that other map features don't come between the point symbol and the label. For example, we don't want to have a bunch of roads come in between a point and its label. We want to try to get that label as close to that point without going on top of it, without overprinting, without there being overlap. We want there to be separation, but still we want it as close as possible once again that particular point is being associated with that particular text. Our book does a good job of doing this. The point symbols that are on land that are close to the coast, you want to have those text, the labels, entirely on land if possible. And similarly, items that are out in the water, you'd want to have the labels out in the water. And I show this here, an excerpt from the book that really helps to show this. Finally, don't exaggerate the letter or word spacing. And so oftentimes you'll maybe try to exaggerate to really showcase this. In this case, we really don't want to do that with point features. Maybe in area features, maybe in linear features, but with point features, we typically don't want to exaggerate the letter or the word spacing. Here's an example of overprinting where the label for Seymour High School goes over on top of Emerson Elementary School. And so although they're both up and to the right, in this case, we want to maybe think about moving Seymour High School somewhere else because of it being on top of and overprinting this particular point. So I thought, well, maybe if I change it to just 2 lines instead of 3 lines, that might help. Nope, that didn't help. I'm still overprinting this. See how this label is going over the Emerson Elementary School point. In this case, okay, I moved it directly to the left, and that's first off, big no-no. Secondly, you can see how the label is covering up the point. So if possible, we want the points and the labels for all the various features, all the various labels to be the same distance from the text, the last letter, to the point symbol. So you want them to be relatively the same distance if it can be pulled off. In this case, Seymour High School is too detached from its identification, from its point. Now we have this highway coming through, we've got other points. We want to, once again, we want to make sure that the label, the text, is as close to, but also relates to its particular location, its particular point. This here, too much spacing. And so it might be something where you're thinking logically, well, wow, how about if I put the kind of sandwich it in here? It fits in there nicely in between this little gap here. But nonetheless, we have this spacing. It's a little bit wonky. We don't want that. We want to clean that up and have less space. So of the options available to us, I would say this is the best one. Notice I also got rid of an unnecessary word, Seymour Senior High School. We really don't need to add the whole senior part. We refer to it as Seymour High School locally, so we'll continue with that. So that also helps to eliminate some clutter. But we can see here we chose top left because top right moves into here. Bottom right maybe gets us so that we're covering up the highway, so I chose top left. In this case, based on just kind of going around tinkering and deciding that this is what looks best. These are excerpts from the book, and so it talks about different things and do's and don'ts over here, things to think about, the best places. Over here we see how there's been alterations made, adjustments made, simple leaders here, some line leaders. It's just kind of point to where we're looking at. Notice that the words here, crab hut, all out here in the ocean, so some things here along the coastline. They clear things up. They put them over here. Notice how it gets all cluttered, and we have overlap here. See how we have the labels overlapping with the features on the map and the coastline, overlapping with the roads. So as much as possible, you want to reduce that. So when you do, notice here you have a mask that was applied. So when possible, we can do a mask, but we want to constantly be moving things around so we don't have features being covered up by other features. Now let's talk about guidelines for linear features. And so here we place the label always. The goal is to put it slightly above, not touching, although maybe you can pull it off. There are some exceptions, but what we think about is we try to put the label slightly above the linear feature. And so you got to make sure you put it in above enough that the bottoms here of G, J, P, Q, and Y don't get down and touch that linear feature. Further, the labeling should follow the general trend of the feature. And so here's where situations where we might have a river over time move. This is where you can then have the label, the text, actually curve with it. So when the line curves, so too should the label. But don't get carried away and make it too curvy where it follows every single undulation of the river, every single curve of the particular river flow. We don't want to do that. Long linear features, instead of having kind of an exaggeration of word or letter spacing to kind of have it cover from one end of the other end of the linear feature, this is where it would be good to have duplicates. And so we don't often have duplicates for point features, aerial features, but linear features, it is logical, for example, for the Mississippi River, to label it in a few different spots because it's such a long feature. As always, avoid upside down labels at all costs. So you might think, well, this river curves and then it goes back this way. Well, you always want to make sure that the text is right side up, not upside down. Here's an excerpt from the book kind of showing how the linear feature always put the text above. And make sure, you got to keep in mind the G, we don't want that hitting there a particular feature. And here, kind of how the particular text follows the curve of the line. And so here, following the general curve, okay, we didn't go nuts having All American River go all the way back and forth. It's just a kind of a nice general pattern here. Here, Long Creek, obviously the name Long Creek, so it must be really, really long. So since it's so long, we'll put it twice. Instead of having L, O, N, G, C, R, E, E, K, we put Long Creek twice. Now let's talk about guidelines for our polygon features. For our larger areas on our map, it's all relative to scale. So if we're zoomed into a particular city in Indiana, then the counties are going to be really big. The counties are going to be the big areas. Well, the key idea there is in those large areas, typically the visual center of the feature is where you want to put the label for that feature. This is where you can consider using the uppercase to label features. But I wouldn't do it too much, especially because the uppercase is going to cause a little bit more cluttering. They're just bigger, and so it can cause some congestion in your map. In the large areas, the letter or the word spacing can be exaggerated to kind of emphasize the aerial extent. Think about California having that California go the entire length of California, since it's such a large area, would be one example. So letting it can be exaggerated here in this case. But small areas, we typically try to think of these like points. And here you definitely want to consider a call out. And so you often see this in the maps of the United States with the New England states. The small New England states have call outs for those smaller areas. So here we just see different examples. Here a polygon, a water body. Here it looks like it's got a little bit of italics. Yeah, and so water bodies, we typically use italics to denote them on a map. And the biggest water bodies, it's going to be then also uppercase. So uppercase, kind of subjective. Ukraine here, yeah, I think both of them look fine, but there is kind of an unwritten rule. Bigger land areas, countries will do all caps or the uppercase font. And so here, scenic area, notice how this kind of spreads out the letters so it covers more of this particular scenic area. Muddy River, once again, looks like it's italics. And so italics, and it's the biggest feature on this particular map, so it's also in all caps. Here you can see the reflection pool, a smaller area in which it's using a different text, so text has changed, and here a smaller area in which a line leader's put in here, identifying this particular soil type to this area. So we can play around with this in ArcGIS, and so here you can kind of change the placement, the position, so you can do curve within the polygon. Of course, this doesn't really look good because once again, in this map, our larger areas, we want to have them centered inside of the particular land feature. Here I did straight and polygon, so you hear they're all straight, but notice what here it's these more narrow counties, how it flips it, in this case, north and south instead of east and west. So ideally, that's not what we want. Ideally, we want them all to be horizontal. In this case, it's an option called placing them along the boundary. This actually is pretty useful. And so this is something you might want to consider, especially making maybe state maps in which you are working with the edge of a state. where two boundaries of states might overlap, or not overlap, but might be adjacent to each other. So, for example, where Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio all come together, it might be good to have this kind of border placement for our state labels. But this isn't really functional. Like I said, our best option is going to be horizontal and in the center of a polygon. Now with water areas, we do tend to kind of change our particular font rules for polygons. And so here I changed the water. First off, what we can do is, embedded in ArcGIS is all kinds of options. And so I just typed in lake here, and it then made this a blue shape. Further, different options here. I chose first off curved and polygon. That's definitely one of the things we're going to think about for water bodies. Curved and polygon is a good idea. Because this is such a big lake, I chose the all caps. I've yet to put it in italics, so it's not proper yet. But here, a little bit more kind of following the guidelines for water features. This here is commonly what we do when we have small areas like here in the particular the eastern seaboard, these smaller states in which they have lines connecting them to their text. Notice here, once again, we have examples of insets. What's nice is most of the software that we have in GIS right now, it does all this for us using live algorithms. And so the one that's embedded into ArcGIS is called Maplex. And so it allows you to kind of play around with the rules for label placement, allows for manipulation of type and all these things. And then further, you can export it into other programs, more advanced programs for those of you who are top-notch graphic designers, especially using computers and digital designing. And if you go to labeling in ArcGIS, over here in more, you'll see the Use Maplex Label Engine. You'd want to make sure that's checked for that to work here in ArcGIS.